Oh, he must have muted me.
Hi everyone, I'm Hanovi Schoonover, the Trainee and Resource Coordinator for Redwind Consulting, and I will be the host for this webinar. Before we begin, for those who may not know, Redwind is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including but not limited to housing and homeless services, children and youth, and elder abuse. This ranges from policy review via email to site visits. If you are interested, you can contact me at honovi@red-wind.net. And now, I will introduce our presenters for today. First, we have Rachael Killgore, who is a tribal member of the Dene. Her clan is the Towering House, and she was born for White People Clan. She is from Gallup, New Mexico, and was born in Chinle, Arizona. She graduated from Western New Mexico University with her master's degree in counseling, and shortly after graduating, she began working in the anti-violence field in her community. She has 10 years of experience providing services to those individuals and family affected by domestic violence and sexual violence, and she has held several roles, including therapist, advocate, grant writer, program coordinator, interim executive director, and supervisor. Our other presenter for today is Stacey Ettawegeshik. She is a citizen of the Little Traverse Bay of Ottawa Indians. She is the lead survivor outreach specialist for the Survivor Outreach Services within the Department of Human Services. She has been with the Survivor Outreach Services since January 2013 and has played an integral role in assisting survivors and helping the program expand and grow stronger. Before working for the tribe, she was the domestic violence counselor and advocate for the local nonprofit agency, the Women's Resource Center for Northern Michigan. She received her Bachelor's of Arts in Physiology from Grand Valley State University in April 2012 and her Master's of Social Work from Michigan State University in May 2018. And I will now turn it over to them.
Thank you, Hanovi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, Stacey, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, do you want to go ahead and start and then I can follow you?
Oh, sure, of course, yes.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
Ani, hello everyone. I'm Stacey Ettawegeshik. I am a citizen of the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Ottawa Indians tribe here in Petoskey, Michigan. And I'm excited to be a presenter here today. So miigwech, thank you.
Attawegeshik. So hello and welcome, my friends. My name is Rachael Killgore. And as Hanovi said, I am a member of the Navajo Nation. My maternal clan is Towering House, and I'm born for the White People Clan. My maternal grandfather's clan is Black Sheep, and my paternal grandfather's clan is White People Clan. And this is how and in this way, I am a Navajo woman. So I was born in Arizona at the IHS. Back then, it was the PHS. And I am from Gallup, New Mexico, and I'm speaking to you today from Logan, Utah. So thank you for being here with Stacey and I today. So part of today's conversation, and Hanovi, if we can change the slide, please. So part of today's conversation, we are going to be talking about some really hard things. And so we wanted to start with a poem. And it's a poem that I wrote specifically for today's webinar because we wanted to do things in a good way as we talk about some painful things. And we want to highlight the resiliency and the healing that comes out of painful experiences and how community and connection are important aspects of that healing for our students, the victim survivors. So you won't have the poem in front of you, and I apologize for that, but I will read it to you today. So the poem is entitled Warrior's Way. Let me hold a space for you to breathe, a place for you to mourn and grieve, or to be still. As long as you need, together, the warrior's way.
Hey, Rachel.
Yes.
Sorry, you were cutting out.
Oh, shoot. Was I cutting out? Okay, I'll move this closer and see if that changes. Okay. So I'll just start back from the second verse. So I am still and I am present. I witness, I hear your as long as you need, together, the warrior's way. Hit by silence, the silence discloses a corridor, and I'm finding ways to listen deeply. A comforting word prompts a healing thread, an ancestor's wish conveyed, onward, the warrior's way. How did that sound? Did that sound okay? Or was I breaking up a bit?
You still broke up a bit, but
It was
most of it.
better. Okay. So we apologize. Sometimes we have these technical difficulties. So if you miss something that I say, so as we move forward in a good way, let's have in our minds how just notice what pops up into your head. You feel free to write it in the chat if you like, or just kind of hold it in your mind. That would be fine too. Next slide, please.
Hey, can everybody hear? Hopefully it's good. So here are some objectives we will be presenting on today. Defining the unspeakable. The unspeakable we're talking about is sexual assault, sexual violence on tribal college campuses, and the prevalence of that. We have to name the unspeakable, like I said. So we will also talk about understanding those reactions of survivors, as well as culturally appropriate response in a trauma-informed way. And then, of course, tribal college campuses response and perspective taking to enhance your trauma-informed approach, not just victim services, but it's important to have faculty and staff trained in a trauma-informed way as well. Next slide.
So again, some of the conversations will be difficult because we're going to be addressing the unspeakable and the effect of experiencing the unspeakable, and the unspeakable is sexual violence. And this is a meaningful thing to acknowledge because, so for instance, in my culture, talking about these things, you know, words carry power, and by talking about these things, it's been said that you can actually bring them into existence like a bad wish. But long before colonialism, before we knew what Western values were, our tribal nations had ways of addressing these things should they arise, and that too should be acknowledged. So there's this balance, right? And you want to be getting feedback from your communities, from our TCU communities, from our Native communities, and what that looks like, and how we should broach this topic in a respectful way. But at the same time, we really want to shine light on it so we don't have victim survivors blaming themselves or communities blaming victims. And the goal is getting back to those ways in which traditionally we were able to address these betrayals, because traditionally they were addressed. So with that said, some things we talk about today may be triggering, so we want to spend just a little time talking about self-care and grounding. Next slide, please.
So I'm sure you all have heard of using grounding techniques, and we thought we would start with this, at the beginning, and just recognize that we all probably are having busy lives and all this pandemic stuff going on. So if you would like, you don't have to, but just thought it would be good to take a deep breath. And sometimes that helps to kind of just bring you into the present moment. And so, like Rachel was saying, this information could be triggering, and we absolutely give you 100% permission to step away if you need to, and just remember to take care of yourselves. So the grounding techniques, you could look at 5 things you see, things you touch, things you can hear, you can smell, you can taste. And this helps with mindfulness. So it can help shift your attention from your internal to your external physical world around you. And there is a website there, the Love is Respect, for more grounding techniques and exercises. And, I have to fiddle with something with my hands. So, whether that's Play-Doh or whether it's, the adult coloring books are, popular nowadays. So that could help as well. And just check out those other resources. And if you have other resources or links you want to share about grounding or other techniques, please share those in the chat. Thanks. Next slide.
Okay, so I switched the speaker, so I'm hoping this will come in a little bit better. So we'll see. So to quote a researcher, Griffith, sexual violence can lead to breakdowns of the family structure and can negatively impact an entire tribal community. So this is why we have to address it, why we have to do our parts in our communities. We are a collectivist culture, Native Americans are, and our TCUs, our tribal colleges and universities, reflect our Native values, and then these values are very different from the sort of this Western individualistic culture. So when students walk into TCUs, they walk in with these layers. So these layers may be multiple forms of trauma, like intergenerational trauma. It could be historical trauma. So being trauma informed, which we'll cover in the next slide, being trauma informed also means knowing the history of Native peoples that we work with, that we serve with, that we interact with, and then being aware of that before somebody comes in crisis. So, our job then is to look more into the history about colonization, about the boarding school era, assimilation, eradication of Native peoples, and then how from those harmful perceptions of Native people were formed and then are carried forward. So any of those stereotypes of Natives are then placed on the generations that follow, right? And so there's a lot of information, a lot of resources out there about how Native people and Native women in particular that talks about how they have been viewed to have little value, and that stems from colonization. And those narratives are so harmful and very misleading and need to be corrected. And we say that because we talk about this because we have to consider the history that exists among tribal nations, because there are effects from that violence that is inflicted on the following generations, and that has a significant impact. And it's foundational, so it sets the tone for what's to follow. So when someone reaches out and is in crisis, we keep these layers in our mind. And after the crisis, our support should continue after the immediate crisis has passed, because the individual is still going to require support from us for the long term. And this maybe looks like checking in, maybe it's more of an advocate role, or other types of support. And the mission for TCUs vary, so it depends on the respective cultures and traditions in the different areas among the different Native populations, but it goes back to strengthening and the success of each of the students and the community in a holistic sense. So when we think about Griffith's quote, this journey, this healing journey, is really important that we're keeping all of these things in mind, that it's not just about the individual, So trauma-informed is about being sensitive to the trauma as survivors, right? So when we help people who are in crisis, we're doing so in this respectful way that considers the person as an individual and validating their experience and their reactions. So their well-being and their wishes are how we want to do things, but it's about being sensitive to the victim survivor's needs and taking cues for them how that should be accomplished. So that's kind of what the victim needs to be done. And we're moving away from this mindset of what's wrong with you because that's what happened to you. That's not only more compassionate, but and then because words have power, I believe you is a powerful message. The victim survivor should not have to convince us of anything. Our priority should be focused on their well-being, because healing words. Fallon and Harris, they have done a lot of work on trauma, and they wrote a book values are, in general, values are, yes.
You're breaking up pretty bad again.
Oh, shoot. Okay. I might try switching to another laptop if that's possible. No. Stacey, how is it now?
Oh, okay. It's better.
It's better. Okay. I just have to switch things. No, you're good. So let me talk briefly then, because I don't know how much time I'm going to have. So Fallon and Harris created these core values that we've adapted here for creating an environment of trauma and safety, creating safe spaces. So this happened even before a student. Yes, it's creating a space. Resources available. Trust is key. It's right. The other person. And then inherent strengths is this is a model of Western medical model. This is I just want to see if, yeah. Oops.
Yeah, Rachel, you're really breaking up.
You know what, Stacey? Go ahead and let's go to the next couple of slides. Hanovi, let me log in on a different computer, okay?
Alrighty.
Okay, let me do that real quick, and then I'll log out of this, and I will be with you guys shortly.
Okay, sorry about that. Always something, right? Anyway, so moving on to the knowledge piece. So the topic we're talking about is sexual violence, right? Next slide. So we talked about naming it, and here's the definition. The long and short of it is that sexual assault is the engagement of unwanted sexual acts by force or threats and most importantly, without consent and unwanted. Consent is everything, right? So that can include, verbal, non-physical. It could be physical, and basically can include any of those, including, and, it could result from, what could result from sexual assault could be, injuries, pain. It could even include inappropriate touching with or without clothing, child molestation. And then a broader category is rape, a broader category is sexual violence rather than rape. And so we just wanted to define it here. And, there's different definitions everywhere, but, obviously it's important to remember it's without consent, unwanted piece. So next slide. So it's important to talk about alcohol, drug facilitated sexual assault, and the statistics are staggering here, as you can see. So tribal colleges are most likely located near or on reservations. And that's why we mentioned the OVC. It's a video series there. They're titled Alcohol Facilitated Sexual Assault in Indian Country. And like I said, it's a series of videos on the OVC website. I would encourage you to check those out if you are able. And so with Indian country specifically, there's a lack of research, right? Lack of representation of us in data. And so this is the data we were able to find. And as you can see on the last point there, approximately 1 in 5 women and 1 in 16 men have been sexually assaulted while in college. Again, that's in general, not necessarily tribal colleges, but numerous studies have shown that drug or alcohol-related sexual assaults on college campuses are more frequent than forcible sexual assaults. And so, there's studies out there that you can check out for more information. If you have other links or resources, like I said before, please share those in the chat, and we can learn from each other there. Next slide. So continuing to talk about this and the staggering stats, again, 43% of sexual assault events involve alcohol use by the victim, and 69% involve alcohol use by the perpetrator. And 96% shows how much alcohol is used as sort of a weapon, right, by perpetrators. They use it to coerce, to sexually assault them, to incapacitate survivors. So it's the most common drug used other than alcohol. It was marijuana. And so this study was in 2007. And so I'm sure there's more updated. It was just, again, hard to find research and studies about tribal college campuses in specifically, but that's, again, about the data and under representation. So thinking about trauma-informed policies and at tribal colleges, things to consider would be having 24/7 access for survivors to services, because usually these assaults don't happen between 8 until 5 o'clock at night, right? So it's important to have hotline and resources out there. And of course, being culturally appropriate, services provided for survivors. So whether that's, having sacred medicines available, or, or having other events happening that are culturally appropriate, so that students on campus can see and can visually see that their services available. Yeah, I think that's about it there. So is Rachel back?
I briefly saw her, but it seems like she logged off again.
Okay, do we want to wait or?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Are we switching to the next slide?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I really think that I've solved this problem, folks. So let me know if I haven't. It's always fun with tech, but this is our world, right? So there are 37 TCUs located on or near reservations, and they operate more than 75 campuses across 16 states. So that is a growing, and that is a beautiful number. We love that. When we looked at tribal campuses, tribal colleges and universities, TCUs, and trying to find stats, I had to look individually at the campuses to look at those numbers, and a lot of them reported zero sex offenses. And so let's look at some other stats and kind of compare those a little bit, because we know that can't possibly be the case, right? When we look at colleges across the country, universities and colleges that aren't TCUs across the country, we see that 1 in 5 women and 1 in 16 men are sexually assaulted. And 90% of the time, the person knows the perpetrator. So these are some heavy stats. The last stat listed under college, forgive me for this, but it should read that less than 5% of completed and attempted rapes were reported to law enforcement officials. So less than 5% were reported. And that number is really low. Now, this is a 2000 statistic. If we take a look at, we contrast that to the Justice Department statistics, most recent, they took a data set that looked at numbers from 1995 to 2013, and they found that 20% of campus sexual assault victims go to the police. So still that number is very low, but we see more of a shift with folks reaching out, which is very promising. Now, if we look at, these are really hard to look at. When we think about Native American victimization, I mean, our place is, our belief is that, sexual violence is not a tradition, that this is not a value that we hold at all. But yet, we see how this has impacted Native people, how this has harmed Native people. And so 4 in 5 Native women and men will experience violence in their lifetime. And a lot of this violence isn't from other Native Americans. It comes from white people, right? And if we look specifically at sexual violence, over half of our Native women will experience sexual violence. And 1 in 4, 28%, a little over 1 in 4 of our Native men have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. Can we go to the next slide, please? So, in taking a look at this, there are a lot of stats here, and I'm not gonna read them to you all because you all can take a look at those. But I really want to bring attention to our LGBTQI Two-Spirit students who report such high rates of violence and sexual violence. This is a vulnerable population. These folks require our attention and our thoughtfulness in how we go about supporting them. And just looking at the stat for transgender folks, 47% will experience sexual assault in their lifetime. So these are huge numbers. This is a huge amount of violence that is happening in our communities. Next slide, please. So it comes back to this. So even with the available stats that we have, we must also recognize that there are limitations to the stats that are available, because this may be due to underreporting, this may be due to the data not being collected, or various other reasons. But this helps, the data that does exist helps us paint a picture, but it's not a complete picture. Next slide. Next slide.
Okay. So, are we doing okay? Are there any questions? I didn't see any, but at any rate, I'm glad that the audio's fixed now for you, Rachel.
Me too.
Right. If anyone just needs to take a, take a breath or anything, that's okay too. Like I said, we totally give you permission to take care of yourselves and, remove yourself if you need to as well. So, so a place of understanding when we're talking about survivors of sexual assault and how, reactions are so different from one survivor to another. So let's come from a place of understanding. There is no right reaction, whether it's right after it happens, the assault, or months down the road. There are many different ways people respond to trauma. Not every survivor is going to react the same. And also, when we talk about that, it's important that you think about and check your own biases. Have that self-awareness of, okay, here's my biases, here's how I'm working through it. And so you can really be there in the moment with the survivor. And like I said, it's individualized. We can't say, this is how a victim should act, or this is how a survivor should be. We can't say that because it's their story, it's their life, it's their experience. And so victim credibility, and the study mentioned there, asked police officers to describe what real victims look like. Were they emotionally controlled? And so they thought they should be emotionally controlled to be credible. So, they can answer questions clearly, they have a straight story, those things. And being trauma informed is understanding that it's not going to be that way. Survivors have their own way of, dealing with it, and it's their life, it's their story. So anyway, other officers said that they had to cry, and they just have preconceived notions how they should look. So again, just mentioning any biases to consider, making those judgments on whether a survivor is credible or not, whether you believe them or not. So that can be challenging, and recognize that we have to work on that as part of our self-awareness. So understandable mistrust, as we kind of mentioned earlier about, intergenerational trauma and historical trauma, there's tons of mistrust in systems in general when we're talking about Indigenous Native people. Due to, boarding school eras and that kind of thing. And so it's definitely a normal response to protect yourself from any system. And, it can be in our genes too, like, intergenerational. It's just, it's there, it's present, and it's important that we understand that. Next slide.
I'm just going to make a note here. If we need to go back to a slide, let me know that I was talking about earlier and I broke up so much. I can certainly do that. So we again apologize for the technical difficulties. So let's talk about reactions and impact, and what that looks like on a psychological, emotional, and physical level. There's an interesting quote by Mary Harvey, and she says that trauma survivors have symptoms instead of memories. And there's a ton of symptoms that folks can have. Looking at a psychological toll, that might be like distress, shock, fear, confusion, all of these listed here. In terms of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms such as like emotional attachment and flashbacks. Then there's also the physical toll, and it's not just the physical injuries sustained during the assaults, if that was the case, but it's also like sleeping problems such as insomnia, or somatic complaints like chronic headaches that folks have to deal with. And what's really insidious about sexual violence is the damage done to the beliefs about oneself and how this affects our self-worth and the amount of shame that we feel when this happens. So there's a lot of symptoms listed in this slide, but again, pointing out that these are all normal responses to trauma. And over time, these may reduce after a few weeks, maybe a few months, or maybe these symptoms are more enduring and they could last for years. So another thing to take note of is there's no rigid timeline for healing. Everybody has their own time for that. And that may look differently for folks. But as you can imagine, if you're having all these symptoms and they're showing up in the student's life, it's definitely affecting their behavior, right? So maybe the behavior as it pertains to college courses, so like their attendance, not showing up to class, showing up late, maybe their disposition is different, their affect is different. And so this really helps us be aware of, you know, some of the things, some of the ways this presents. And then it also makes us aware of our own messages that we may be sending to the victim survivors, to the students. So like, for instance, you know, what are the biases that we have? If a student comes in and they're late, you know, are we labeling that behavior as difficult or lazy or uncaring or uncooperative? So we really need to pay attention to the whole picture, and this will help us do that. And again, just to emphasize what Stacey had said before about the reactions, like all reactions are valid, and they may even differ depending upon the culture. So next slide, please.
So let's discuss changing the mindset of victim blaming. Instead of, you know, saying to a victim survivor, not saying literally, but, you know, even thinking it, what's wrong with you? Let's think about instead, what happened to you? You know, what trauma have you experienced to bring you to this day? That's part of being trauma informed, is understanding that, you know, the individual you're helping has all this experience beforehand. And so at any rate, like I said, it's not like we're literally asking the question of what happened to you, because that probably would not be the most professional thing to do. But, you know, like I said, just thinking about it, coming about in that way, that perspective. And again, we're talking about self-awareness. So if you yourself are a victim service provider, you know, definitely you got to check your biases, think about those myths, you know, or, you know, the judgments and the perceptions, and really just be there and be compassionate for survivors. But also, you know, faculty and staff at tribal colleges. You know, I'm not sure who is present on this webinar today, but, you know, whatever profession you're in, if you're going to come in contact with college students on a campus, you know, sexual assault is pervasive, as we've been saying with these statistics. So, you know, it could very well happen that someone is going to disclose to you what's happening, you know, so it's important that you think about those and have the discussion and talk about it. And also part of changing the mindset is changing from victim blaming to holding the perpetrator accountable. They're the one making these choices. They're the one responsible for this assault. They're the one that decided to do that. Make them responsible for what happened, instead of the focus being on the survivor, instead of the focus being on, why is she doing this? Why is she doing that? Why is she not cooperating? You know, and so it's important to really switch that, have that paradigm shift of not victim blaming, but holding the perpetrator accountable, not just in, you know, the criminal justice system, but in our communities as well. That's definitely important to mention. Next slide. Next slide.
So there are 3 questions that we have up on the screen for you all in the PowerPoint. So the first is, how was sexual assault viewed traditionally? So from a cultural, traditional lens. And what did accountability look like, and for whom, right? Who was held accountable, and how did that look like? And then what values can be understood from these stories? So we have an ask of everybody. If you feel free to answer all 3, but if you could answer at least one of those, how you understand it to be. In the, I guess it would be the chat part of this. And also, you know, some of us as Native people may not be aware of these stories, that some folks may be removed from this traditional knowledge or these teachings, but that's a result of colonization. That's not our fault. So however, whatever stories that you all heard, because this is a space where we can learn about some of those stories in history. So if you're able to do that, we would appreciate that. And then as you're doing that, there's a lot of traditional stories in tribal nations across the country and even across the world, right? And so changing women in Navajo culture, for example, or white buffalo calf women in Lakota traditions. So these women were considered holy beings. Changing women created the 4 original clans in the Navajo stories. You know, as Navajos, we trace our family through our bloodlines of the female, and this really illustrates the importance that women hold traditionally and in the community. Women are sacred, they're life givers, they're nurturers, protectors, they have this connection with water, right? And we understand this through our traditional teachings and stories. So stories are very, very powerful in that way. So I'm looking at the chat. Yeah, absolutely. So some values that are understood are women and two-spirit, and children are sacred. Absolutely. And that's definitely a thread that runs throughout Native cultures. So next slide, please.
Okay, so we're talking about awareness of self, place, and our tribal nations. And so we have to talk about values and strengths of each of our tribal nations, where we're from, where we're coming from. There's 573 federally recognized tribal nations across the country, and then many indigenous people with tribes that are not state or federally recognized across the country. And so we wanted to, excuse me, my cat's in my face, get off. Sorry. We have to consider the diversity and the sovereignty of each tribal nation. So the pictures here are just, you know, a few examples of some similarities that we could see across tribal nations. For instance, the medicine wheel there, and the connection to, you know, the 4 colors, the 4 directions, 4 sacred medicines, you know, the circle of life, you know, spiritual, physical, emotional, and it shows that we're all interconnected. And the other photo we have is of a two-spirit individual. And a similarity could be also that, you know, two-spirit individuals like Rachael mentioned in the chat is that two-spirit are sacred. They are honored. We honor them in our culture, in our traditions, and in our teachings. So thinking about those, consider how to bring the understanding of cultural teachings, understanding the values and strengths, and bring that into your response to survivors. That's being culturally, you know, culturally appropriate. That's being trauma informed. That's thinking about, you know, this person's life, this victim survivor's life, and where they're coming from, and really being compassionate and empathetic. So, like, for example, here in my tribe at Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians, you know, we have seasonal ceremonies. And so, you know, that happens across the country, I'm sure. We probably conduct them in different ways, you know, but we have that underlying, you know, values, and we have the underlying strengths in each of our tribal nations. So it's important to, you know, understand the survivors' specific, you know, where they're from, where their nation is. So next slide.
So when we look at identifying the strengths, in folks, that in itself is a protective mechanism, a factor, because acknowledging those strengths in others is really important. That empowers, and it has this protective element. And then culture is protective, right? Our traditions, values, beliefs, and practices, these things are all tied to our identities. And when we know who we are, then, and we know who we belong to, the community we belong to, we know without a doubt that we are precious. And folks who have harm done to them start to lose that sense of knowing that they are precious. And when we support another's identity, that also is a protective factor. And again, considering our two-spirit relatives, you know, they have a role, as Stacey pointed out, a role and a valued place in our communities. And also thinking in terms of, you know, we have to be aware that people may or may not practice ceremonies in the same way, or may, so there's different ways of that practice. So just being aware of that, and that we're honoring their cultural identities, however it is that they choose to identify. And then also having community supports available, such as groups and talking circles or pro-social activities on campus. All of these things aid in the healing process and the connection and feeling supported and belongingness within a community. And then just feeling connected in that way. And then Stacey had talked a little bit. Stacey, did you have a story that went along with this also?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I do.
Good.
So I went to Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I went there for my bachelor's in psychology. And I was part of a Native student organization. And I have to say that was probably the best experience I've had. And that definitely I would consider a protective factor for me. I actually went to a powwow instead of going to a bar crawl, you know, so things like that. It's just so important to be connected to your community and have that support and encouragement. There was also a Navajo code talker that came to the university, and, you know, our student group was able to be there and meet him and listen to him. And I actually had an exam that day. And I told my professor that, listen, this is more important to me than this exam. And obviously I was able to take it another day, but I just made that point that, you know, this is my culture. This is my identity. These are my relatives, you know, this is what is really important to me. And so, you know, having that is, I definitely think, is a protective factor. So. Yep.
All right. Thank you so much. I was laughing, muted. I was muted, but I was laughing. So that's great.
Okay.
Next slide, please.
Okay. So conversations. We are obviously having this conversation today, and I'm so happy that, you know, you're joining us today. And, you know, so you wanted to learn more about this topic. You want to be more trauma informed. You want to, you know, improve on that and learn more. So these are difficult conversations to have. You know, it's not easy. It's not like we can just all sit down and be like, let's talk about sexual assault today. You know, and I'm so used to it because it's part of my job, but at the same time, I can understand how it may be uncomfortable for others. But anyway, we have to name the unspeakable sexual assault. We have to name it. We have to mention it. We have to talk about it. So there's definitely a stigma to sexual assault, right? You know, like I was talking about earlier, there's this perfect victim, you know, oh, they were drinking and they deserved it, you know, that kind of thing. We need to stop that. And so let's think about how we can erase that stigma and think about the values and the strengths and the protective factors within our Native communities and our Native culture that, you know, that can help erase that stigma. So how can we holistically, how can we assist in erasing the stigma and support survivors? So You don't have to answer right away, but you can just think about it. And how are you having these conversations on your campuses, whether you're a faculty, a staff, a service provider, a college student, you know, really think about how you're having those conversations and how they're coming up, and remembering how important it is to talk about it. So we have to have those conversations. And again, thank you all for being here today on this call or this webinar, and talking about it with us today. And so also, we have to check those biases again. I'm going to keep saying it. We're going to keep saying the self-awareness, and you just have to go back to that bias piece. You know, we'd like to think that we don't have those biases, or, you know, have those myths, how do you say that? Myths, whatever, in your head, you know, about sexual assault survivors. Like, this is how it happens. You know, this is how someone gets raped. You know, it's just, we can't have those. We have to work through them and really think about it. So next slide.
Yeah, those conversations are important to be held. These were questions taken from McCallum in a study of Aboriginal people in Australia. And this is how they broached the subject with the community as a whole. And so we're borrowing those questions, those prompts for today. I should have added a question mark to each of them, but that's okay. They're questions. And so these 4 questions listed, you know, you answer them in the comment section if you're willing to. You don't have to answer all of them, maybe just one of them. Because so the first is, you know, what is the current response to sexual assault? And because this is, we're talking about tribal colleges, think about the tribal colleges near you, the tribal colleges that you are affiliated with, and you may not know, and that's okay. And that would be your response is, I don't know. But this is not just starting conversations, but this is starting courageous conversations. So what is the current response to sexual assault? What knowledge of past strategies do I have? What was used before? And what do I believe may be a barrier for people coming forward who have been sexually assaulted? And then what are my suggestions for future strategies? So really heavy questions, important questions, probing questions, but questions to keep in mind. So if anybody feels the urge to post in the chat, that would be great. And then we can take a look at those. But certainly you are not required to do so. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide.
Oh, next slide, Hanovi. Thank you. So responses and supports. We're going to talk about a scenario here. So next slide. Because we kind of wanted to work through this with everyone here on this webinar today. So I'm going to read this scenario, and there's a question at the end. And so that's what we want you to think about. So Cheryl is a female student in her freshman year at the TCU. She was sexually assaulted 2 days ago and was encouraged by a friend to reach out to someone at the college. So your role at the college is an adjunct professor. Cheryl is presently taking a course from you. So in this instance, think about from a culturally appropriate, victim-centered approach. What things might you say? What things might you do? Are you considering things like, could Cheryl be, you know, traditional in her culture? You know, how does she interact with her family and her elders? And considering all those factors we have talked about on this webinar today. So please just take like 1 minute to write your responses in the chat box about the question. So what things might you say or do in this situation with Cheryl? Anybody? Bueller? Or is it that you need more information about Cheryl?
And I feel like also, Stace, that this is going to relate back to when I was cutting in and out about a trauma-informed, the values that we were talking about before. And so this may be my faults because I kept cutting in and out with that piece of things.
Oh, no. Okay, I see some comments now.
Mm-hmm.
So someone says, tell her that she will be assisted and she has options. Yep, that's definitely great to say, you know, there's resources out there. There's this program. I can get you a brochure. I can get you a phone number. And Miranda says, I want to know more about Cheryl.
Yeah.
Well, she's made up, but you know.
And then, you know, again, I'm just going to throw in checking your biases too here. And I know that Stacey said it a few times, but sometimes our immediate reaction, you know, paying attention to that. It's like, oh, this is uncomfortable. Is there somebody else that can help her? You know, so checking those things too, kind of what's going on internally with us as well, is a good place to, is something to consider.
Okay, most colleges have a rule where professors cannot counsel a student. No, certainly not. But, you know, it could be, like I said, a matter of fact of, you know, having a brochure, a number, having a name of the services provided there at the college, or even outside of the college. Is there, you know, a nonprofit organization that you could refer Cheryl to? Okay. So not seeing anything else right now. Did you want to move on?
Yeah, let's go to the next slide if we could. So within this vignette, we also have real challenges on Indian country that affects our students' ability to get their needs met after a sexual assault. And so these are things that will also be taking play that will intersect with everything else. And these are like poor resources, poor financial resources, there's transportation issues, jurisdictional issues, not enough law enforcement, data collections. I mean, as we're always underrepresented in the data, we're typically an asterisk in the data, right? And so these are just challenges to anticipate going forward that as these things come up, because sexual violence is not going away, what can we do to kind of mediate these things ahead of time, to get sort of ahead of it and anticipate these things going forward? So this is all happening in the background as well. Next slide, please.
Okay, so some things you may be considering, thinking about Cheryl still. So like I was saying, what resources are available? It could be on campus, it could be outside of campus. Are there, you know, support groups for survivors of sexual assault? Are services highly visible to survivors? So visible meaning, are there, you know, I don't know, posters or flyers or brochures over the campus that students have easy access to? You know, on the website, is there a specific page where you can see, you know, the services, what number to call? And so if you yourself are not a victim service provider, are you aware of these services? You know, even if you are, you know, faculty, staff at the college or anywhere else, it's important to know those services, to know the name of it, you know, and to know how to contact them. And also, it's so important to make sure services are consistent and confidential. Victim services, top priority is confidentiality. It is imperative to helping survivors. You know, they may feel, you know, shameful and guilty and don't want anyone to know what happened. And, you know, so it's just reassuring them that these services are confidential. You know, maybe because tribal campuses could be small, right? So it's a small community like our tribal communities. And so it's just really important to keep that confidentiality in mind. And then also consider body language. So if, you know, you're a professor or faculty, staff, and, you know, someone could possibly be talking to you about something difficult, you know, or even a service provider, you know, are your arms crossed? Or are they open? You know, and just that proximity and like being self-aware of how that person could be perceiving you, right? And let the survivor know that they are in charge. This is their story. This is their experience. You know, telling a survivor what to do, like, oh, you need to report this right away. You know, that's typically not what a survivor is looking to hear. They're looking for, you know, compassion and empathy, so they can tell their story, you know, in a confidential, safe place. And also culturally appropriate, like, are there medicines available, you know, or whatever helps in healing? You know, is there artwork around? In the victim service provider at the college campus, is there, you know, do they have culture kits available to give survivors? And some other things to consider, you may fumble for the words of what to say, like I am right now and have been. But it's just important to know that, you know, everyone makes a mistake. Like, you may say something wrong and you can just own that and be in that space and just say, you know what, okay, I think what I just said was wrong. Let me try to think about this and say a better response. You know, that's okay. Everyone makes those mistakes sometimes. So. And then the language piece, Rachel, could you talk about that?
Yeah. So what's interesting is, like, the way that things are defined can be defined very differently. So like the word respect, that can hold a very different definition in my community versus your community, right? And so being aware of those differences. In the work that I did with sexual assault services of Northwest New Mexico and Gallup, New Mexico, and I see some of those gals from my office here today. Hi, girls. But you know, one of the words I would commonly hear is it just was so somehow. It was somehow. Somehow is a powerful word because it has this whole meaning behind it. And so really trying to understand the meanings of the words that our folks are using is really important. And then being aware that meanings can be different among a word, right? So that's kind of what I wanted to touch on as well.
Thank you. Okay, and then lastly is the community responsibility. So our values of the community, as part of that community, you have that responsibility, you know, and considering these things that we've talked about is, you know, is our community saying to survivors, we believe you? You know, whether or not literally saying it, but, you know, showing support to survivors in that way, that's saying, you know, I believe you and, you know, support you. So next slide.
So let's say the next thing that happens is you talk with this person, Cheryl, and you're offering her, you're connecting her with resources. You're telling her about the services that are offered on campus, or the resources that are offered on campus. And as she listens to you describe these things, she's really interested in meeting with somebody. And let's say there is an advocate on campus and you walk her over to their offices, because part of being trauma-informed then is taking that extra step, right? And so you walk her over to those offices so she's not alone. Now I want you to imagine when you walk into their offices or office, what do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell when you walk in? What is the general feel of the office? whether or not this really exists at your campus or in your area, I want you to think about what you would like to see exist, I suppose. So is there someone greeting you? And then how are you greeted? When you look around, I'm very visual, so I like to see if there's artwork up on the wall. And then is the artwork, is it for that area, right? Is it inviting? And if it's inviting, how do you know that it's inviting? Maybe somebody offers you water. And then how long are you waiting before somebody meets you? And then are people asking for your permission? Not sort of directing like you sit over there, but would you like to have a seat? Would you like to come back? Is it okay if I ask you these questions? Is now a good time to talk? So think about what those interactions look like. And then are medicines available? What's the tone of voice? And then what are the words that are chosen in these circumstances? So get that in your mind about how you envision that. And if you feel so compelled, you can write it in the chat. Next slide, please.
Okay. So here are some things that you may be considering. Is remembering that it's important to be strength-based and victim-centered. Again, this is about that survivor. It's about their experience. And it's about them telling their story when they're ready, if they're ready. So how might this trauma affect Cheryl in the weeks to come? It's not just the day after she's going to be affected. It's going to be every day after that. It's going to be months. It's going to be years. So how could this affect her schoolwork? Could she miss classes? Could she miss a deadline to submit an assignment? It might affect her personal life as far as relationships. Like maybe she becomes upset or avoidant and distant from her friends and family. If you would like to, you could put in like what else Cheryl could experience during this time in the chat. You can put that in the chat if you want. And what might you do to help? So it would be good to ask her permission if you can check in with her every day, or is it every other day, once a week, just to see how things are going. Is there a way, like if she's having problems with missing classes and deadlines and whatnot, for lack of sleep or, those PTSD symptoms that Rachael mentioned before, is there a way, like if you're the advocate, the service provider, you could get a release to speak with, professor or, something along those lines so that she could, maybe have some more time to work on the assignment and, so can explain the situation of what's going on. And so collaboration with different resources on campus, outside of campus. Like I said, it's important to know those programs, the names, the contact information, and have all those available, because that adds to the supportive environment of the college campus as a whole. And other things could be perspective taking, like learning how to take this perspective of others. That's pretty much empathy, and compassion, right? So was there something else about that, Rachael?
Sorry. Just that, I always call perspective taking like it's kind of a superpower. Because it takes some work and the effects are, of having empathy and of having understanding and really digging deep. That's such an incredible thing to do and to offer somebody. It's such a gift. So perspective taking, if you're engaging in that, you're really doing something right.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide.
Okay, so we're asking you to do a lot with Cheryl, right? We're asking you, we've infused a lot of values in this presentation, because values are really the heart of a people. They're a heart of a culture, and it's really our backbone. And it could differ from community to community, from native community to native community. But what those values relate to also is being a good relative. You know, how are we being a good relative to Cheryl? So it's not just merely handing a pamphlet. It's maybe taking that extra step and saying, let me call them and let me see if somebody's available. Of course, not sharing any information, but taking that extra step, right? Because people are at the heart of this this work. It's about making connections with one another. So these are some things, these considerations are some things to keep in mind. And as I'm going through a couple of them, you know, think about how these might be addressed or how these might intersect with one another. So with culturally appropriate protocols, if we don't know the protocols in the area, you know, we're talking with elders, we're talking with tribal people, tribal leaders, members of the community, you know, the leadership, the administration of the TCU, because we want to understand that better, the protocols. And we also want to garner support for ending sexual violence on our TCU campuses. Other things to consider is the view of time. So time is not linear, it's not structured, right? It's very flexible and things happen in their own time. So having patience with folks and understanding that people are on a different healing path than what we believe folks should be is really powerful. Getting the student advisory board started, getting student inputs on campuses and working together so that these voices are all heard is important. And then just lastly, just the partnerships I want to touch on. I can't tell you how important that those partnerships are outside and inside the campus. It really makes for smooth transitions and connections with students who may experience a sexual assault. And that's what it always comes back to, is making sure that that we're contributing to their healing and not taking away from that. Next slide, please.
Okay, so this is pretty much our last slide here. So ideas for creating awareness. So awareness on campus of, you know, the victim service that's available, and not just that, but, you know, sexual assault awareness in general. So, you know, is there a calendar of events around that, you know, survivors could go to? Like, this day is the survivor support group, or this day is, you know, an event happening, or, you know, other things like that. And maybe there could even be featured articles from students writing, you know, writing their own essays or their own, you know, thoughts and topics down. Is that in like a newspaper, or I don't even know, I'm sure it's on social media somewhere, on the website, or, you know, are there chat lines? Like, is there a texting line someone could text if they're a sexual assault survivor and just for support? And something that the program I work in, we have mesh bags with cedar, and we also have, you know, tobacco, sweetgrass, and sage available, and a little, you know, pamphlet in there about the medicines and how to use those for your healing and for yourself. So having those things, you know, could feel, you know, very culturally appropriate and could help a Native survivor feel that much more comfortable and at home. Yeah, are there graphic designs to advance prevention? So like, you know, talking about consent and, you know, things of that nature. Are there pretty posters and flyers around? Awareness campaigns, and then any like booths or information things or health fairs. Yeah. And then what else, Rachel?
I guess I would just add that getting student engagements and and creating awareness surrounding sexual violence is really important. There's a lot of creative things that you can do. You can have storytelling. Photo voice is an interesting thing because what you do is you take a picture of something and then you tell a story behind it. And this can be exhibited in like the lobby area. But again, it always comes back to creating that awareness. In our community, Gallup, we have a lot of, with the Navajo Nation, we have a lot of just move it's, if you've heard of those before. And that's bringing awareness to being healthy, exercising, that kind of thing. And so a run or a walk is really great. I know with SAS, we have an annual, I don't work there anymore. I just call it we still, but we have an annual run, walk event each year. So yeah, so bringing awareness is a really important thing because it chips away at that stigma, at that shame, and it changes the narrative, which is what we really truly need to get back to is changing the narrative where it's more from a cultural perspective. So
yeah, and so those are just some ideas to incorporate on your own college campus. And so, yeah, that is about it. The next slide is some other resources.
and it's also followed by all the references that we cited in the presentation. So there's a bunch of resources in the references slides as well. So feel free to go through that. If you all have resources that you are willing to share, please post those in the chat also. I've been to a lot of webinars where I've gotten so much, not only from the presenters, but from the chat boxes, because folks are posting so many great resources in those messages. So feel free to do that as well. What do you think, Stacey? Should we go to questions if there are any questions?
Yeah, let's do that too. I was just going to ask Hanovi, this will be, it's being recorded, right? And then it'll be available on Redwood website, or it'll be sent out via email?
So it will be on our YouTube within the next few days. And typically we post them up onto our website in about groups of 3. So it should be up on our website at some point, yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so if there's any questions or just comments, I feel like that was a lot of information at once. Okay, somebody put in, this is an interesting way to find out what biases you may have. Okay. That looks interesting. Thank you.
Oh yeah, I've actually done that before. It's fun. I mean, it's very eye-opening.
Okay. Great.
Does anyone else have anything they'd like to add? Any questions, comments, or resources that you have? All right, well, we'll get to wrapping up then. Thank you, Rachel and Stacey. Before we end the call, I'd just like to let you all know about our upcoming webinars. So coming up on July 30th, there is sexual assault on tribal college campuses, and that will be at the same time as this one, so 1 p.m. Mountain Time. And that is currently the only webinar that we have set up. And we will be sending out newsletters when we have more approved. So, with that said, I'd like to thank once again our presenters, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next webinar.
Thanks,
Stay safe,
everyone.
everyone.
Miigwech and Bama P. Thank you, and see you later.